how I want to proceed for my presentation and for my discussion is just to do a little bit of a context setting of the discourse around climate change itself, discuss some of the principles, and also look at how climate change is being tackled within the legal framework in our country, in India. And of course, most of climate change related discourse, the treaties, arrangements, commitments that have been made by different countries we've been watching these evolve over the years. And I think one of the key changes that we witness is over the course of the 42-year period that Pavan mentioned, that we've seen how climate change was always framed in a manner where the crisis was something that was impending, but something that would come at a much later stage in time, right? It was always very distant. You would see the climate crisis would hit us in 2030, 2040, 2050. But now the discourse has evolved to recognize the immediacy, the urgency of it, and also the reality of climate change. So I think that has been one of the key changes that allows for coordinated action, for political will to be constructed around the need for such legislation. So international agreements, like Pavan said, they're great, and a lot of these documents have very lofty principles. But the problem with them largely lies in the fact that there are no enforcement mechanisms. The only way that you can translate these into anything effective is when you have legislation enacted domestically in municipal law, so the laws of our country. And so just to get started, let me discuss a little bit about what the framework is in India itself. Now, all environmental laws, the foundation of them lies in the Constitution of India. In the directive principles of state policy, the state is enjoined to protect the environment, and similarly, a duty is cast on citizens also to protect the environment, forests, animals, and so on. In addition to this, we have a series of laws that have been enacted to protect the environment. Some of these flow from international treaties and obligations made. And Article 253 of the Constitution of India allows the translation of these international commitments into municipal law. So we have the Environment Protection Act. We have various acts for instance, we have for water prevention and control of pollution. We have the Air Act. We have acts for biodiversity, for forests, and so on. And we have acts for dispute resolution. So we have the National Green Tribunal, which is set up by an act. And while this framework exists for environment protection and for controlling pollution, they don't directly tackle climate change itself. So these are relevant to climate change insofar as, for instance, if we sort of take climate change for what it specifically is, which is change in the climate on account of basically carbon emissions, greenhouse gases, and so on. These acts may contain provisions to check that kind of pollution or those kind of emissions. But climate change is something that needs to be seen with a much broader perspective and with a much longer time scale. So it's not something that has to be controlled immediately, right? So emissions going into, let's say, water bodies controlled by the Water Act. There are penalties for industrial units and all that release untreated waste or effluents into the water. And that is something, the effect of it can be seen with immediacy. The controls can also be operated, but climate change is something, the greatest hurdle or the greatest challenge to dealing with, which has been potential deniability or placing the risk in a far future scenario where it doesn't immediately affect you. And because of that, because the discourse did that, there was a distancing, which led to a creation of doubt of whether the effects were real or not, and the possibility of deniability of its effects. So now that there is clear recognition, now that frameworks are in place and being developed constantly, we see those in the form of pledges, we see the NDCs, we see commitments, and a lot of these commitments to international obligations are based on technologies that don't currently exist. So climate change obligations still operate in a tricky space where it is difficult to ensure that the obligations are properly being met. And in case they are not, the enforcement mechanisms, those are still very difficult to settle upon and also see if they function. So we have the environment, we have the legislative framework, we have these laws dealing with the environment. We don't have any law dealing directly with climate change. Pawan mentioned that there was a bill that was introduced in 2015 for climate change, but that has not been enacted. And so perhaps one of the things that needs to be relooked at is whether if a specific legislation for climate change is due, and if so, what it could look like. Now, moving to the principles, which was the other broad thing that I wanted to discuss. The principles around environment law and environment protection, these flow from international treaties, as well as, and these have also been recognized by the Indian judiciary in a series of cases. And some of them are well known, and everyone would have heard of things like polluter pays principle, or you've heard of doctrines such as the public trust doctrine, and you have the precautionary principle. So with climate change, where you are looking at long-term effects and controlling long-term or containing potential future climate crises, it is important to err on the side of caution. So the precautionary principle is one which says that um, basically if you can choose between options of what would do the least amount of damage to the environment, you should do whatever is necessary to ensure that you mitigate and minimize the potential impact on the environment. And this would be one of the important things when dealing with climate change as well. Um, while we are now seeing tangible effects of long-term rise in temperatures because of emissions, um, it's no longer left up to conjecture. The principles that have been distilled into, which have basically been implemented through the judiciary, through an activist judiciary that we've seen through the 1980s onwards. A lot of the interventions to protect the environment have come through the judiciary, but this is this is not all. In order to give effect to a lot of these principles, there are other instruments that are also available. Just last year, there was a large discussion around one such instrument, which is the Environment Impact Assessment Notification. Now, the 2020 notification had been significantly watered down in comparison to the 2006 notification. But it is tools like this which allow us to actually evaluate what the tangible, measurable impact of any given project, development projects, construction projects, or anything else would be, and then to take corrective and mitigative measures, giving effect to principles, say, such as the precautionary principle. Um, and these are the kind of tools that will help us effectively tackle climate change. So while international obligations and all are good to guide us in the right direction, to create the necessary discourse, to create political will and concerted action, it is still going to be tools such as this. It is going to be interventions by public spirited individuals, by organizations, by instruments, by the use and by the strengthening of instruments such as EIA, which will help actually and effectively contain climate change. I would just like to conclude with broad strokes of what I believe should be or could be the way forward. Climate change, again, this is not something that is limited or restricted to anyone. It affects the world at large. It will affect different communities, different countries disproportionately. Weaker communities, countries that are in low-lying areas that are susceptible to a rise in sea levels, will be disproportionately affected. But that doesn't mean that we should distance ourselves from those communities and from the challenge and from the risks that these issues will pose. We already have climate refugees. We have situations of drought in places such as in South Africa, and we see large scale climatic variations that are occurring, disturbances that are occurring, weather patterns, climatic patterns, and everything which are changing. That would be difficult for anyone to deny or overlook. And I think all of these need to serve as a wake-up call for everyone, not just for our leaders, because political will is also largely shaped by an informed citizenry, by an informed civil society. And I think a large part of the duty also falls on civil society to ensure um, that there is a sort of well-informed and a continuous engagement and pressure on those who decide the policies and decide the laws that will help us contain climate change, to ensure that obligations are met, and also so that responsibility is not fragmented and distributed amongst different individuals, because this duty and this responsibility belongs to everyone. And I think as long as we remain cognizant of this, we will be able to meet a lot of the obligation, all the targets that have been set, the obligations that have been put in place. But we cannot leave it simply to countries or to the setting up of laws or creating of legislations. There needs to be constant oversight. There needs to be pressure. There needs to be engagement. There needs to be a sense of common and differentiated responsibility, as they kept saying, for the obligations even under Kyoto. So I think with that, I will conclude and concede the floor. And I just want to thank Council for Green Revolution for the opportunity to speak here today.